conference, and I'm really excited about it. And sorry, something is showing, I think, on my slide. Okay, so before I would start, I would like to ask you a very brief question to recall all the moments during the conference when your mind started to wander to new, unexpected topics and you stopped being focused on the talk, on the keynote or poster session. Usually it happens quite often, and according to some research, it takes up to 1/3 of our waking hours activities. And off-task thinking has some very important functions. According to literature, it can enhance our creativity. It can helps us to plan and anticipate some future challenges and tasks. And it provides us with a mental break from a boring or too difficult activity. However, there is a whole bunch of research showing that off-task thinking, like mind wandering or daydreaming, can have a whole list of maladaptive consequences. First of all, it can lead to neglecting our ongoing activities. It can increase our negative affect, impair emotion regulation. Mind wandering can also lead to cognitive biases. And finally, it can increase the risk of psychological disorder. In the clinical psychology field, we have nowadays a debate on whether to consider maladaptive daydreaming as one of psychological disorders or not. So our initial research question was to find out what factors, processes, or mechanisms are responsible for the switch between adaptive mind wandering, so for example, taking a break or anticipating future, and maladaptive version of task and related thoughts, for example, repetitive negative thinking like rumination or worry. It is also important to note that today, both mechanisms, maladaptive mind wandering and rumination, are considered as transdiagnostic risk factors. So risk factors that are involved in occurrence and maintenance of more than one psychological disorder. So first of all, we tried to find a definition of mind wandering and rumination to be able to further test what is the mechanism of the switch between those two processes. When we had a look in the literature, we found out that we are quite far from the consensus of what is the link between rumination and mind wandering. We can find some authors suggesting that rumination and repetitive negative thinking, mind wandering and repetitive negative thinking are two end points of the same continuum, repetitive negative thinking maladaptive and mind wandering adaptive. The other authors, like Watkins, suggested that mind wandering is a subcategory of a larger construct of maladaptive repetitive negative thinking. And on the other hand, Sally brought up the idea of mind wandering as an umbrella term and rumination being a part of this larger mind wandering family. And finally, Christoph suggested that mind wandering and rumination are two separate categories and we shouldn't consider them together. It is, however, important to note that in her work, she focuses mostly on depressive rumination and not on the larger term of transdiagnostic repetitive negative thinking. So finally, we decided from clinical psychology perspective to leave those labels of mind wandering and rumination aside and to focus on a general definition of task and related thoughts. Obviously, task and related thoughts are unrelated to one's current activity, but they also occur unintentionally. and in the absence of direct stimuli from the environment. The second question, once we came up with this work definition of task and related thoughts, was what makes task and related thoughts maladaptive. And by maladaptive, we mean impairing one's everyday activity, increasing negative affect, and impairing emotional regulation. In the literature, we can find three hypotheses on the maladaptive feature of task and related thoughts, and those hypotheses are not exclusive, so they can be true at the same time. The first one, called often content regulation hypothesis, suggests that task and related thought maladaptive feature will depend on the content of this type of cognition. The second one, called context regulation hypothesis, suggests that we will have some kind of interaction between task features and our self-control. So if we're performing a boring, easy task, it is perfectly adaptive to have a high level of task and related thoughts. But once this task becomes harder and requires more cognitive resources, we should use our executive functions, our self-control, to stop task and related thoughts. And if we are unable to do that, that means that our executive functions, and particularly inhibition, is not working correctly. And finally, the second hypothesis suggested that a task and related thoughts might be maladaptive depending on its function. In the present research, we focused on the first two hypotheses. First of all, we identified in the literature a whole list of features of task and related thoughts that might be potentially maladaptive according to published research. And among these features, we have identified concrete or abstract processing. This is the idea of Watkins from repetitive negative thinking models, suggesting that abstract processing will be maladaptive. Delay from the present moment, once again by Watkins, suggesting that focusing on the present moment in off-task thinking will be more adaptive. Self-referential, we also identified control over one's thoughts as one of the characteristics, repetitiveness, verbal future, so form of inner speech, although in the research there is no consensus of whether this kind of this form of task and related thought will be adaptive or not. And finally, we will control also for valence of task and related thoughts. It is important to note that all those task and related features were previously tested, but only few of them were tested in ecological settings, and they were never previously tested in one model, in one study. So to test our hypothesis that, or to test which of those off-task thinking characteristics will affect participants' negative affect, we ran a study with over 200 participants. In the first stage of the study, participants were filling in self-reported questionnaires, and in the second part of the study, they were using an ecological momentary assessment application on their smartphones, and the application was sending signals 7 times per day for 7 days, and at each signal, participants were assessing task and related thoughts features that I already mentioned a moment ago. And additionally, we were assessing task features, so whether the task participants were performing at a given moment was interesting, stressful, whether it required effort, motivation, and whether participants felt competent to complete this task. And obviously our dependent variables, so mood, we assessed valence and anxiety. In this study, we also had a daily diary part, but I won't discuss it in this presentation. And finally, at the end of the study, we end up with over 8,000 momentary observation, and the compliance rate was 80%, so quite good for a daily sampling study. First, we analyzed what task and related thoughts features affect off-task thinking intensity, mood, valence, and anxiety. And to do that, we used multi-level modeling. All the predictors, so off-task thinking characteristics, were introduced at level 1 into the model, and the level 1 was nested in participants, and no predictors at level 2. And we found out that all off-task thinking characteristics that we identified in the literature were significant predictors of off-task thinking intensity, but the most significant ones were control over one thoughts, delay from the present moment, and repetitive feature of cognitions. The off-task thinking characteristics that affected mood valence were particularly valence of off-task thinking. This is not surprising, but also control over one thoughts. And finally, in anxiety, also valence and control, but additionally, we have also a repetitive feature of task thinking. And one small precision in the mood anxiety, higher score indicates lower anxiety. This is quite tricky, but don't be surprised by the sign of the coefficients. After testing this first hypothesis of main features of task and related thoughts affecting participants' everyday mood, we tried to test the context regulation hypothesis. So to test whether there is an interaction between task difficulty and the control over one thought. So in this model, at level 1, we introduced the answer to the question whether the task performed currently by participants requires a lot of effort, and the question about whether participants are able to control their off-task thinking. And additionally, we introduced also the interaction effect between effort and control. Our results confirm the context regulation hypothesis, suggesting that indeed task and related thoughts decreases with the task demands, but it's true only for participants with the subjective high control of task thinking. So as predicted by Kane and McWay, when the task becomes or is difficult, we are stopping our off-task thinking, but only if we have enough control over those off-task thinking to do so. And finally, we checked also whether mind wandering and rumination at the trail level affects off-task thinking intensity in participants' everyday life, and whether it affects mood, balance, and anxiety. And the results are quite surprising. It seems that only trait tendency to ruminate affects everyday off-task thinking intensity and mood, but not daily daydreaming. So what conclusion we can make from our results? The first one and the most important for us is that particular task and related thought features or characteristics seem to be linked to participants' affect, both with affect balance and anxiety. And those, the most significant predictor of participants' everyday affect are control over off-task thinking, but also repetitiveness and delay from the present moment. It seems that those characteristics might be important independently whether we call this process mind wandering or rumination. And this conclusion might be important from the clinical perspective, and particularly from the perspective of process-based cognitive behavioral therapies, where we will address a particular features of the process in the clinical treatment. The most important feature of off-task thinking seems to be control over those kind of cognitions, and it was already previously shown for rumination by Zeche and collaborators. That was a meta-analysis, but also for mind wandering, but by Ottaviani. Our results are also extending the previous results from a German team, showing that rumination might play a mediator role between mind wandering and affect. And taking into account the results of our study, we can ask ourselves a question whether it is really a mediation model or whether we should take into account some particular features of off-task thinking without making a distinction between rumination and mind wandering. However, there is still a lot of work to do. The first one is to do lagged analysis of everyday life task of task thinking and affect, because all the results I've presented today are cross-sectional. Next, it is also important to take into account in the future studies the freely moving characteristic of task and related thought. We haven't done it in this study, and according, for example, to Christoph, this is the main feature that will enable us to distinguish between mind wandering and rumination. And finally, considering that control over off-task thinking seems to be a key to its maladaptive feature, it seems also important to test in further studies whether there is a difference between subjective feeling of control over one off-task thinking and more objective measures of executive functions, and probably particularly inhibition and attentional control. And finally, long-term plan is to test also the third hypothesis on off-task thinking function, and particularly avoidance. We have some first results of preliminary research suggesting that indeed, self-control or control over off-task thinking will be important in reducing the intensity of off-task thinking and reducing negative affect, but only for a neutral and positive task. In a pilot study, we showed that sometimes when the task is too difficult, or too distressing, maybe it is better characteristic. If the task is too distressing, participants, even though they have enough self-control resources, have still also high level of task and related thoughts. So this is the plan for further research to test not only context and content hypothesis, but also to test task and related thought function. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer if you have any questions.
Thank you. We're actually running a little bit behind right now, so I think it would be best to move on. But any questions in the chat, please follow up or email.